Before we begin, I want you to forget everything you think you know about Jeffrey Epstein, just for a moment. Because this story isn't only about a man with power, money, and connections. It's about a possibility that is far more disturbing, that he was never the one truly in control. And if that's true, then everything the world believes it understands about this case might only be the surface of something much deeper, something far more protected, and something far more dangerous than anyone wants to admit. What if Epstein wasn't the architect, but the tool? What if the real story isn't about the face everyone recognizes, but about the invisible hands that opened the doors, built the network, and kept everything running in plain sight? Because tonight, we're not just asking what Epstein did. We're asking the question that changes everything. Who was above him, and how many people already knew the answer? You know, back then, I carried a storm of strange, almost paranoid suspicions about what was really happening behind the scenes. There were too many gaps, too many contradictions, too many moments that simply didn't add up. Details slipped through the cracks of logic, leaving behind a quiet unease that I couldn't shake. And the most unsettling part wasn't the confusion itself, it was the silence. No one seemed willing to explain anything. No one stepped in to clarify, to reassure, to make sense of it all. He said that in 1998, long before the headlines, long before the arrests, long before the names began surfacing in public. More than 2 decades before the world would start piecing together fragments of a story that had been hiding in plain sight. And now, looking back from the present, those early suspicions don't feel so irrational anymore. In fact, they seem to trace a path, one that now leads through documents, connections, and a growing web of unanswered questions. So if even a fraction of this is true, then what was really going on? How did someone like Jeffrey Epstein remain untouched for so long, moving freely, building connections, maintaining influence in circles where even a whisper of scandal can destroy careers overnight? By now, everyone knows the name. Everyone has seen the headlines. But the question that lingers, the one that feels almost deliberately avoided, is far more unsettling. Who is managing him? Who opened those doors? Who ensured that access was never denied, that protection was always present, that consequences never quite arrived? Because the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to believe that Epstein was ever just one man acting alone. What once sounded like distant, exaggerated fears, things people dismissed as paranoia or fantasy, now seem harder to ignore. The patterns are there, faint but persistent. And what many still fail to connect is that Mel Gibson isn't simply speaking about Epstein as an isolated figure. He's pointing toward something larger, something above him. The possibility that Epstein wasn't the architect, but the operator. That someone else designed the system, handed him the keys, and allowed it to function in plain sight. In that light, the reason Hollywood has struggled to fully recover from the Epstein scandal may not only be because of what Epstein did, but because of what his existence implied. That he may have been enabled, funded, and protected by forces the public has never truly seen. Start with the most obvious observation. Jeffrey Epstein did not resemble a self-made man in any traditional sense. There was no clear, verifiable origin of wealth that matched the scale of his lifestyle. No transparent business empire. No widely recognized path that could logically explain how he accumulated such extraordinary influence. And yet somehow he moved effortlessly among presidents, billionaires, supermodels, royalty, celebrities, and tech elites. He traveled in private jets. He owned a private island. He possessed properties of staggering value. And perhaps most striking of all, he seemed to hold leverage in places where others held power. That doesn't happen by chance. It doesn't happen because someone is merely charismatic or well-connected. It suggests something deeper: structure, infrastructure, a system that was built, not stumbled upon. It suggests that at some point, someone recognized his usefulness and decided to invest in it. That is the point Mel Gibson has circled around for years. He has spoken about a lingering instinct, that quiet sense that something wasn't right. Thoughts that felt too unsettling to fully trust at the time, yet too persistent to ignore. And as time passed, as more information surfaced, many of those instincts began to feel less like imagination and more like early recognition. What makes that significant is not just what he said, but where he was when he said it. Gibson wasn't observing from the outside. He was inside the system. He attended the gatherings. He sat in the rooms where influence was exchanged quietly without cameras, without scrutiny. He saw how power operated behind closed doors, and the pattern he keeps returning to isn't just about scandal, it's about structure, about management. Because when you examine Epstein's world closely, it doesn't look chaotic. It looks organized. It looks deliberate. There were assistants coordinating schedules, accountants managing finances, recruiters sourcing individuals, intermediaries facilitating introductions. There were layers of logistics, appointments, flights, meetings, transactions, all functioning with a level of precision that suggests planning, not improvisation. That is not the footprint of a lone individual navigating elite society by chance. That is the footprint of a system, a network with roles, responsibilities, and continuity, a structure that sustained itself. And once you recognize that, the question shifts. It's no longer whether Epstein had help, that's already clear. The real question becomes far more difficult to ignore: who stood above it all? That question grows even heavier when you revisit Gibson's own trajectory. The version most people remember is defined by collapse, the DUI, the controversy, the headlines that reduced a complex figure into a single narrative of downfall. But that version is incomplete. It's curated. The story that preceded it is rarely discussed. According to long-standing accounts and his own later remarks, Gibson claimed that years earlier he had provided authorities with specific names. Individuals he believed were connected to exploitation within Hollywood. He stated that he gave those names on the record. If that is true, then what followed becomes the most important part of the story. Because from the outside, it appeared that nothing followed at all. No sweeping investigation, no public reckoning, no visible disruption to the system. Careers continued. Influence remained intact. The industry moved forward as if nothing had ever been said. That kind of silence does more than raise eyebrows. It creates unease. When serious allegations are reportedly handed to authorities and nothing surfaces, people are left with only two possibilities: failure or protection. Who has the power to bury something before it becomes visible? Who has the reach to ensure that names never become headlines? Who can prevent a story from ever becoming a story? That level of influence doesn't sit at the surface. It exists higher, beyond individual actors, beyond single industries, possibly beyond the structures the public normally sees. Then came 2006, a DUI arrest in Malibu, something that under ordinary circumstances would have been a temporary scandal, a moment of public embarrassment followed by gradual recovery. But that is what happened. Instead, it became a turning point. Gibson made deeply offensive remarks, and the reaction was immediate, intense, and unforgiving. His career unraveled with astonishing speed. Now, that reaction does not excuse what was said, but the contrast remains difficult to ignore. Hollywood has, at times, tolerated troubling behavior from powerful figures for years. Yet in this case, the response was swift and absolute. For those who see a larger pattern, that difference raises a question: why here and why so completely? To those who support Gibson's perspective, the answer is not that he was uniquely guilty, but that he had become uniquely inconvenient. That whatever he had seen, whatever he had said, whatever he might have known, had made him a liability within a system that depends on control. And that is where the story begins to shift, from something controversial to something deeply unsettling. That is where the story stops being just a scandal and begins to feel something far more unsettling. Because the implication in Gibson's argument is not simply that Epstein surrounded himself with powerful people. That much is already known. The deeper claim is far more disturbing, that Epstein may not have been acting as an independent operator at all, but as a tool, an intermediary, a mechanism, perhaps even an asset within a much larger system of influence and control. And once you start looking at the case through that lens, the scattered pieces begin to reorganize themselves into something more structured, more deliberate. What once looked like chaos starts to resemble layers. The first layer is the recruitment layer, the surface level. This is where everything appears polished, glamorous, almost aspirational. Fashion connections, elite social circles, private events, invitations into rarefied spaces. Promises of opportunity, promises of transformation. It is the layer that draws people in, the one that feels exciting rather than dangerous. Names connected to modeling, luxury, and high society begin to take on new significance here, not necessarily as proof of wrongdoing, but as part of a system that facilitated access. Then comes the second layer, the leverage layer. This is where the tone shifts. In this interpretation, people were not simply attending parties or networking socially. They were being observed, positioned, documented, placed in environments where vulnerabilities could emerge, where private behavior could become usable. In that sense, Epstein's role becomes something more strategic. His value was not just in who he knew, but in what he could collect. Information, weakness, leverage, the kind of currency that does not appear on balance sheets but can move power quietly behind the scenes. And then there is the third layer, the one that unsettles people the most, the layer above him, the one that, if it exists, does not operate visibly, the level that funds, protects, coordinates, and remains out of reach, not loud, not public, but deeply embedded, the layer that does not need recognition because it controls the structure itself. This is why connections like those involving Leslie Wexner continue to draw so much attention whenever people attempt to understand Epstein's rise. Their relationship has been examined for years, not just because it existed, but because of how deeply Epstein was trusted within it. The granting of power of attorney alone stands out as something extraordinary, an arrangement that goes far beyond casual association. It represents a level of access and authority that feels structural rather than social. Whether or not it proves intent, it undeniably raises the stakes of the question. How does someone like Epstein gain that kind of power unless someone already established allows it? Then there is the intelligence angle, the possibility that Epstein's value extended beyond social access into something far more strategic. This remains debated, but it persists because it offers an explanation that connects many otherwise disconnected elements. If Epstein's operation involved collecting compromising material on influential individuals, then his role shifts entirely. He becomes not just a participant, but a collector of vulnerabilities. Someone who transforms private behavior into leverage. Someone who turns secrecy into currency. And if that interpretation holds even partially true, then the people above him would not necessarily be the most visible names. They would be the ones who benefit quietly. The ones who never need to step into the spotlight because the system works on their behalf. This is also why some observers argue that the Epstein network cannot be viewed in isolation from the broader entertainment machine. In this perspective, Hollywood, fashion, politics, media, and finance are not separate ecosystems. They are interconnected. They overlap, reinforce one another, and at times protect one another. The same structures that elevate individuals can also contain them. The same mechanisms that build public image can also control narrative. And the same gatekeepers who decide who rises can just as easily decide who fades. That is why many broader theories eventually extend into celebrity culture and the music industry. For some, the concern is not just about documents or associations, but about recurring patterns. Young talent identified early, identities reshaped over time, public personas carefully engineered, compliance rewarded, dissent quietly punished. One piece of evidence alone proves nothing. A contact entry, a photograph, a quote taken out of context. But what gives these ideas momentum is the perception of pattern. Not isolated incidents, but a system of management operating across different industries. This perspective also explains why Gibson's film choices continue to attract so much attention. Supporters argue that his work is not random, that he returns again and again to themes of hidden corruption, exploitation, innocence at risk, and systems that protect themselves at the highest levels. Films like Sound of Freedom resonated with audiences not just because of their subject matter, but because they echoed concerns already forming in the public consciousness. To some viewers, it didn't feel like fiction. It felt like a dramatized reflection of something uncomfortably close to reality. Because at the center of it all lies a familiar promise. We can make you a star. We can change your life. We can open doors no one else can. It is a promise built on ambition, hope, and vulnerability. And if the Epstein case revealed anything, it is how dangerous that promise becomes when it is placed in the hands of people protected by wealth, influence, and silence. So when all of this is brought together, the argument often associated with Gibson's perspective is not really about the visible names, the celebrities who appear in headlines or documents. It is about the structure beneath them. At the lowest level are the visible participants, the guests, the attendees, the people whose names appear in logs and records. Some may have understood very little. Others may have understood more. But they were not necessarily directing anything, they were within it. Above them sits the transactional layer, individuals who may have been influenced, pressured, or quietly leveraged. Relationships that were not purely social but strategic. This is where silence becomes valuable, where compliance becomes currency. And above even that, if the theory holds, is the directorial layer, the invisible tier, the level that does not need to appear publicly because it controls the environment itself. It controls access. It controls opportunity. It controls consequence. It shapes who is heard and who is ignored. That is why this level is the hardest to expose. It has no need for visibility and every reason to avoid it. It does not operate through noise, it operates through quiet decisions. Who gets support? Who gets funding? Who gets attention? Who disappears from relevance? In industries built on exposure, that kind of control is absolute. And what happens when someone steps outside that system? That is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Corey Feldman spoke publicly for years and was often dismissed or marginalized. Mel Gibson himself became one of the most controversial and isolated figures in the industry after his fall. Jim Caviezel, after aligning himself with controversial narratives, found himself largely outside mainstream Hollywood support. Different individuals, different circumstances, but for those who see a pattern, the outcome feels familiar. When someone becomes inconvenient, the system does not always destroy them loudly. It simply removes their access and lets silence do the rest. And that may be the most chilling form of power at play. Not overt censorship, not public threats, just controlled relevance, fewer opportunities, less visibility, fewer allies. In a world where image is everything, making someone invisible can be more effective than attacking them outright. Then came the waves of released documents. The files, the records, the resurfacing of names, meetings, and associations tied to Epstein's orbit. The scale alone intensified everything. Yes, the names matter. Yes, accountability matters. But if Epstein was not the top of the structure, then what the public has seen may only represent the middle layer, the visible part designed to absorb attention while something deeper remains obscured. And that is where this story becomes truly unsettling. Because if Epstein was only the face, then the real story is far from finished. It means the public may have been staring at the surface while the deeper machinery remained hidden. It means the figure everyone recognizes may have been central, but not ultimate, not the architect, not the origin, not the highest point in the chain. So the question still hangs there unanswered. Who was above Epstein? For decades, Gibson and others have suggested that the answer exists, that the pattern points somewhere higher, more protected, more difficult to confront than most are comfortable admitting. Maybe the files are not the conclusion of the story. Maybe they are only the beginning of what is finally coming into view. And if that is true, then the most unsettling question is not whether someone stood above Epstein, but how many people already know and still choose not to say it out loud. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you feel like this story is far from over, subscribe, because it may only just be beginning. If you've made it this far, then you already feel it. This story isn't finished. It doesn't end with Epstein. It doesn't end with the files. It leaves one question hanging that nobody seems ready to answer. So I want your honest opinion. Drop it in the comments. Do you think Epstein was acting alone, or part of something much bigger? And if you want more deep, unfiltered breakdowns like this, stories that most people won't even touch, make sure you subscribe. Because what we just uncovered today is only the beginning.